35 years have already passed, since the moment the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. From a geopolitical standpoint, countries became independent, flags changed, and borders were drawn. But the reality turned out to be much more complex. De facto, many of these states still remain within the Kremlin's gravitational field. Those who dare to make a real break and pull their country out of this orbit immediately face colossal pressure and systemic problems. In this episode, we will conduct a detailed review. How does Moscow continue to maintain its influence in the post-Soviet region? How do the mechanisms of control work, from soft power and culture to harsh military blackmail and an economic stranglehold? We will assess how effective this policy is today and what the prospects are for countries that have chosen a path away from the former metropole. Let's start with the deepest level of soft power. This is the foundation upon which everything else rests. The basis for Russia's influence in the region is still the shared cultural and linguistic layer established centuries ago. We must understand that this is no accident but the result of a systematic policy. In the Russian Empire, the process of Russification occurred through direct bans and coercion. In Soviet times, however, Moscow switched to a hybrid method. Besides imposing the language, it was implemented through the education system and social elevators. Public opinion was shaped that the Russian language is the language of the city, science, career, and high value. While the national languages of the republics were pushed into the category of secondary or exclusively rural, we see the result today. By the time the Union collapsed, millions of people in the new republics not only spoke Russian but also fully identified with Russian culture. Of course, the situation varies. In Kazakhstan or Ukraine, the Russian language still remains a socially significant factor. In the Baltic states, its role is much smaller. There, the local population was historically less subject to Russification and more quickly restored its identity. Despite the loss of direct control, the Kremlin continues to actively lobby for the interests of the Russian language. This is not just a matter of linguistics, it is a matter of loyalty. Moscow continues to produce a colossal amount of cultural product. Cinema, music, literature, everything is consumed excellently in the near abroad. A huge role, of course, is played by Russian media holdings. Russia's possession of giant resources to sponsor them allows their agenda to be dominant. Through them, a positive image of the Kremlin is formed, government policies are justified, and a unified information dome is created over the entire region. This is a crucial propaganda mouthpiece. At the same time, Moscow is betting on the youth. Massive quotas for grants are offered, grants for studying at the best Russian universities. The Kremlin actively opens university branches abroad. MSU in Astana, Baku, Tashkent, Dushanbe, and Yerevan. These aren't just educational centers, they're breeding grounds for future elites loyal to Moscow. The Russian Teacher Abroad program completes this picture. Russian teachers go to remote areas of neighboring countries to teach in the Russian language, fully funded by the Russian budget. Thus, Moscow remains the de facto intellectual capital for a significant part of the post-Soviet space. In recent years, Moscow has found a new powerful lever, the theme of conservative values. Russia tries to present itself as the main defender of the traditional way of life, both regionally and globally. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly and publicly spoken out against the Western LGBT agenda, emphasizing the traditional family. This is also backed by tough legislation. After the constitutional changes in 2020, Article 72 appeared there, protecting marriage exclusively as a union between a man and a woman. A chain of bans followed. From the law banning propaganda among teenagers in 2013 to a full ban on all propaganda in 2022. The next year, the LGBT movement itself was declared extremist. Transgender transition and gender reassignment surgeries were banned under threat of criminal prosecution. Meanwhile, authorities try to boost the birth rate with payments and a child-free propaganda ban. Though Russia hits record highs for divorces and abortions, this rhetoric of defending foundations is very popular in the conservative Caucasus and Central Asia. For them, Western left-wing ideology often seems alien and irritating, and Russia skillfully offers itself as a clear alternative. When soft power and a shared culture don't yield the desired result, Moscow turns to hard power. This is direct pressure and intervention through military mechanisms. The main tool here is the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, created back in 1992 as an analog to NATO. Today, the alliance includes Kazakhstan, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and formerly Armenia, though relations with it are now, essentially, on the brink of collapse. The CSTO allows Russia to legally use its troops to support favored regimes. And the most recent example is the protests in Kazakhstan in January 2022, when the CSTO contingent helped President Tokayev stay in power. Membership in this bloc is not just protection, but also a debt trap. Countries receive preferential prices on Russian weapons and cheap loans for rearmament. For poor republics with security issues, this is a critical factor. And for this, they must pay with the presence of Russian bases, like in Gyumri, Armenia, or in Belarus, where the recent deployment of nuclear weapons has effectively turned the country into a military staging ground for the Kremlin. This creates direct pressure on local authorities and a constant threat of occupation in case of disobedience. Another favorite method of control is the creation of pseudo-republics on the territories of neighbors. This is a tactic of managed chaos. The Kremlin supports separatist movements, provokes conflict, and then brings in its peacekeepers to lock in the problem. That's how Transnistria in Moldova, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia in Georgia appeared. Well, next we'll touch on us too. Conflicts there have been smoldering since the 90s, and Russian troops are still there, essentially illegally. In 2008 in Georgia, this tactic escalated into a direct attack by Russian troops, the seizure of territories, and the recognition of their independence. This creates a permanent crisis for the countries, a problem of territorial integrity, and blocks their path to any Western alliances. And with Ukraine, the Kremlin tried to use the same scheme. In 2014, when soft power finally failed, Russia proceeded to annex Crimea, and essentially a unique precedent for modern Europe. The creation of the DPR and LPR in Donbass was supposed to be another lever of blackmail. But when even that wasn't enough, to bring Ukraine back under control in 2022, Moscow began a full-scale intervention. But economic levers are no less effective. The interconnections between the countries were established back within the framework of the Soviet Gosplan. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many enterprises simply could not operate without each other. And Russia, thanks to the size of its economy, has always played a dominant role here. Let's just look at the numbers. Russia's GDP is $2.5 trillion. For comparison, Kazakhstan's GDP is 320 billion, Ukraine's before the war was 225, Uzbekistan's is only 159. In such a configuration, Russia always dictates the terms. If we take a look at the export-import balance, the picture becomes even clearer. 10% of Kazakhstan's exports and 27% of its imports are tied to Russia. Uzbekistan, 13% of exports, 21% of imports. And tiny Armenia is even more critically dependent. 23% of exports and over half of all imports come from Russia. The Russian economy is much more complex and larger. It's resilient to the loss of one neighbor, while for the neighbor losing the Russian market is a catastrophe. The Eurasian Economic Union only cements this dependence, placing countries under the control of Moscow regulators in exchange for investments and loans that Russia often writes off in exchange for political loyalty or control over strategic assets. Energy is perhaps Moscow's most well-known whip. Russia remains the main supplier of energy resources in the region. Since the 90s, the gas tap has been used to pressure both Ukraine and other countries. During the rule of pro-European Viktor Yushchenko, oil and gas crises occurred regularly. Russia hiked prices and cut off supplies in the dead of winter to crash the government's ratings. Even with friendly Belarus, there were conflicts, resulting in Russia gaining full control over the strategic enterprise Beltransgaz in 2011. Now we see the same thing in Moldova. Cutting off gas is used as a tool to fuel discontent with the pro-European authorities. An interesting example is Kazakhstan. The country has its own oil, but it has no access to the sea. 80% of Kazakh oil goes through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which passes through Russian territory to the port of Novorossiysk. And this is the perfect leverage. Russia can at any moment suspend the neighbor's exports for technical reasons. Well, add to this the Rosatom company, which builds nuclear plants across the region on favorable terms, thereby tying the country's energy sectors to Russian technology for decades to come. And we must not forget the human factor. Moscow remains the main magnet for labor migrants. For some poor countries in the region, it's not just a matter of earning money, it's a matter of survival for the entire economy. In Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, remittances from Russia account for 15 to 50% of the country's total GDP. This gives the Kremlin the ability to blackmail the governments of these countries as they please. The threat of cutting off the migration flow or mass deportations would instantly trigger a socio-political explosion in Dushanbe or Bishkek. And Russia has repeatedly used this leverage and forced local authorities to make concessions on important geopolitical issues. To sum up, we see that Russia uses a complex combined arsenal from soft culture to nuclear blackmail. However, after the start of the full-scale war in Ukraine in 2022, this system began to fail. Moscow's influence is rapidly diminishing. The attitude towards it has become extremely cautious. The most striking example is Armenia. The inaction of Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh led to the loss of the region and the flight of the population, causing a deep rift with Moscow. Central Asian countries have begun active diversification, turning towards Turkey and China. They realize that Russia is an unpredictable partner. Moldova and the Baltic states have finally severed ties, fearing they will be the next victims of aggression. To date, only 2 countries have moved closer to the Kremlin. Belarus, whose regime was saved by Russia in 2020, has effectively turned into a puppet state. And Georgia, where the current authorities, remembering the horror of the 2008 war, chose concessions to Moscow, fearing a repeat. Russia is desperately trying to maintain its dominant status, but the historical process of imperial collapse, I think, has entered its terminal stage. Thank you all for watching and for your support. Take care of yourselves.